The snow fell in thick, silent sheets across the Northumberland moors, each flake settling on the torn white fabric of what had once been a wedding dress. Blood bloomed dark against the silk like winter roses, and in the center of it all, a woman's hand reached toward nothing. Pale fingers trembling, grasping at air, at hope, at anything that might save her from the cold creeping into her bones. They left her in the snow to die. They expected him to look the other way. They were wrong. Duke Sebastian Ravenscroft sat motionless on his black stallion, his breath misting in the frozen air as his eyes fixed on the crumpled figure at the edge of his estate, the border between his land and the wild moors beyond. No expression crossed his face, no shock, no pity, no hesitation. He simply dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots crunching through the snow with purpose. The woman's eyes fluttered open as his shadow fell across her. Her lips moved, barely a whisper cutting through the howling wind. "Don't. He'll kill you too." Then her head fell back, consciousness slipping away like smoke. Ravenscroft didn't answer. He stripped off his heavy cloak and wrapped it around her shaking body, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. Her dark hair spilled across his arm, matted with ice and blood. He turned toward Raven's Hollow estate, its stone towers rising like sentinels against the storm. That's when he saw them. Torches. Distant but approaching fast through the tree line. Orange flames dancing against the white darkness, and with them, the sound of horses, of men's voices calling out a name he didn't yet know. They were searching. They were coming for her. Duke Ravenscroft's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His grip on the woman shifted, more protective now, more deliberate. He didn't run. A Ravenscroft never ran. But his stride lengthened, powerful and measured as he carried her toward the iron gates of his estate. Behind him, the torches grew brighter. The voices grew louder. Someone shouted an order. The hunt was closing in, but the gates of Raven's Hollow loomed just ahead, and once she passed through them, once she entered his domain, everything would change. They expected him to surrender her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. If you skip now, you'll never know what the Duke did next. And trust me, you'll regret missing the moment he made his choice. Don't be that person who has to come back later asking what happened. Subscribe, like, comment, and share with your family and friends. Now let's continue. The woman in the snow wasn't moving anymore. Duke Sebastian Ravenscroft had seen death before, on battlefields, in sick rooms, in the cold political machinations of London's elite. And he recognized its approach in the bluish tint of her lips, the shallow rise and fall of her chest, barely visible beneath the ruined wedding dress. He didn't call out, didn't announce himself. He simply moved. His cloak came off in one swift motion, the heavy wool still warm from his body as he wrapped it around her trembling form. She was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that spoke of days without food, of running until there was nothing left to run on. Ice crystals clung to her dark hair, and when he lifted her into his arms, her head lolled against his chest like a broken doll. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind howling across the moors and the steady crunch of his boots through the snow. Then her eyelids fluttered. Brown eyes, unfocused and desperate, found his face. "Don't!" Her voice was barely a breath, each word costing her. "He'll kill you too." Before he could respond, not that he would have, her eyes rolled back and she went limp in his arms. Unconscious, possibly dying. Definitely someone else's problem that he was now making his own. Ravenscroft turned toward Raven's Hollow, toward the stone walls and iron gates that had stood for 3 centuries, toward safety. His stride was measured, efficient. 300 yards to the gates. 200. The snow fell heavier now, as if trying to hide what he was doing. Then came the lights, orange and flickering, appearing like demons through the darkness behind him. Torches, at least a dozen of them, spread across the tree line where the estate met the wild moorland, and with the light came sound, men's voices carried on the wind, rough and urgent. "Lady Clara! Search the boundary! She can't have gone far." Horses whinnied. Someone barked orders. The hunt was organized, methodical. They knew she'd come this way. Ravenscroft's eyes narrowed, the only sign of emotion crossing his face. His arms tightened around the woman, Lady Clara, apparently, and his pace increased, not running. A Ravenscroft didn't run from anything or anyone, but faster now, purposeful, each step eating up the distance to his gates. 100 yards. The torches were spreading out, covering more ground. 50 yards. He could hear individual voices now, could make out the silhouettes of mounted men against the snow. 20 yards. The iron gates of Raven's Hollow loomed before him, already opening as his groundskeeper spotted his approach. "Your Grace!" the old man called out, alarmed at the bundle in his master's arms. Ravenscroft strode through without stopping, and the moment he crossed the threshold onto Ravenscroft land, the gates began to swing shut behind him with a heavy, final clang. He disappeared into the torchlit courtyard, into the sanctuary of stone and ancient privilege, carrying a half-dead woman in a bloodied wedding dress. Behind him, the searchers reached the gates. But they were too late. She was his now. Clara woke to warmth, and that alone told her something was wrong. She shouldn't be warm. She should be dead in the snow. Or worse, back in that room with Percival's hands around her throat, his voice in her ear promising all the ways he'd make her regret running. But instead there was silk against her skin, a fire roaring somewhere close, and heavy velvet curtains filtering weak morning light into shades of deep crimson. This wasn't her room. Wasn't any room she recognized. Panic hit like ice water. She threw back the covers. Someone had changed her clothes, dressed her in a clean nightgown, and stumbled toward the door. Her legs barely held her, muscles screaming from her flight through the moors, but fear pushed her forward. She grabbed the handle, twisted hard. Locked. Her breath came faster. Of course it was locked. She'd escaped one cage only to wake in another. She pulled again, harder, the metal biting into her palms. "Let me out!" Her voice cracked, hoarse from screaming, into the wind. "Please, let me—" The lock clicked. Clara stumbled back as the door opened and a man entered, tall, dark-haired, his presence filling the room with an authority that needed no announcement. Behind him came an older gentleman carrying a physician's bag, his expression professionally concerned. "You're safe here, Lady Hargrove." The first man's voice was calm, measured, as though he stated simple fact rather than opinion. "Safe?" The word tasted like ash. Clara's back hit the wall, her hands spread against the cold stone. "You don't understand. He owns me. There's a marriage contract, a binding seal blessed by the church. Lord Blackwood has legal right to reclaim me." The Duke, because he had to be the Duke of Ravenshollow, who else commanded a room like that, exchanged a glance with his physician. "Dr. Gray will examine your injuries. Then we'll discuss Lord Blackwood." "There's nothing to discuss." Her voice pitched higher, hysteria clawing at her throat. "I fled my wedding night. Do you understand what that means? I'm his wife in the eyes of God and law. The contract was signed, the vows spoken, She couldn't finish. Couldn't say what Percival had done before she'd thrown herself through that window and run. Dr. Gray stepped forward gently, his weathered hands open and non-threatening. "My lady, you're burning with fever. Please allow me to—" "Lord Percival Blackwood." She said the name like a curse, like conjuring a demon. "Former Member of Parliament, personal friend to the Lord Chancellor, connected to half the peers in London." Each title was a nail in her coffin, a reason why this Duke, whoever he was, would hand her back the moment Percival demanded it. "He'll come for me." Ravenscroft's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. Interest, perhaps, or calculation. "And when he does?" Clara whispered, her legs finally giving out as she slid down the wall to the floor, exhausted and beaten and so very tired of running. "Even you can't stop him." The Duke studied her for a long moment, this broken woman in borrowed clothes making declarations about his limitations. Then the corner of his mouth lifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, in something that wasn't quite a smile but carried the weight of a promise. Challenge accepted. The messenger arrived with the dawn, his horse lathered and steaming in the cold morning air. Mr. Tobias Finch wore the livery of a royal courier, which meant the letter he carried wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in polite language. Duke Ravenscroft received him in the great hall, still in his riding clothes from an early survey of the estate boundaries. He knew what was coming. Men like Percival Blackwood didn't accept losses quietly. Finch presented the letter with a formal bow, the wax seal bearing Blackwood's crest pressed deep into crimson. The Duke didn't reach for it. Instead, he gestured to his head steward, Mr. Winston Aldridge, who'd served 3 generations of Ravenscrofts and knew when his master was making a point. Aldridge broke the seal with steady hands, though his eyes flickered with concern as he scanned the contents. "Shall I read it aloud, Your Grace?" "Please do." Ravenscroft's tone was mild, but his staff knew that tone. It was the voice he used before making decisions that couldn't be unmade. Aldridge cleared his throat. "Lord Percival Blackwood requests the immediate return of his betrothed, Lady Clara Hargrove, who was taken from the vicinity of his estate 3 nights past." A pause. "She is legally bound by contract and church blessing, and her presence at Ravenshollow constitutes an interference with lawful marriage." The housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Ashford, exchanged glances with the groundskeeper near the door. This was worse than they'd feared. Aldridge continued, his voice growing tighter. "Failure to comply will be interpreted as theft of noble property and deliberate obstruction of matrimonial rights under the law." He looked up briefly, then finished. "You have until dawn tomorrow to return Lady Hargrove to her rightful husband. Lord Blackwood trusts in your cooperation and good judgment." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to quiet its crackling, as if the room itself held its breath. Finch stood rigid, waiting for the Duke's response to carry back to London. The staff remained frozen in their positions, butler, housekeeper, footman, all acutely aware that their master was being given an ultimatum by one of the most politically connected men in England. "Your Grace," Aldridge said quietly, stepping closer. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Lord Blackwood has the Lord Chancellor's ear. Half the Privy Council owes him favors. If you refuse this—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. This could destroy you, hung in the air like smoke. Ravenscroft took the letter from Aldridge's hands, his movements unhurried. He read it once, thoroughly, as though examining a particularly unimpressive piece of livestock. Then he folded it with precise, deliberate creases and set it on the side table as if it were nothing more than an invitation to tea he had no intention of accepting. "Your Grace?" Finch prompted, his professional mask starting to crack. "Lord Blackwood will require a response." Duke Sebastian Ravenscroft looked at the messenger with eyes that had stared down charging cavalry and unimpressed crown ministers alike. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of Ravenscroft authority. "Send my reply. No." Tobias Finch had delivered messages to kings and condemned men, but he'd never felt quite so much like an executioner as he did riding through London's grey morning toward Lord Blackwood's Mayfair townhouse. The reply he carried was shorter than any formal correspondence he'd ever handled. A single folded paper sealed with the Ravenscroft crest and containing exactly 3 sentences. Lord Blackwood received him in his study, a room of dark wood and leather that smelled of tobacco and old money. He sat behind his desk with the stillness of a predator, his pale hands folded on the polished surface. "Well?" One word, clipped and expectant. Finch placed the letter before him and stepped back quickly, instinct screaming at him to put distance between himself and whatever was about to happen. Blackwood opened it without ceremony. His eyes scanned the contents once, twice. Then he set it down with such careful precision that it was somehow more frightening than if he'd thrown it across the room. "I do not answer to Lord Blackwood," he read aloud, his voice soft and cold as winter frost. "Lady Hargrove remains under my protection. Do not ask again." A pause. "Signed, Ravenscroft." The silence stretched. Finch barely dared breathe. Then Blackwood smiled. It was the kind of smile that made men check their backs for knives, the kind that promised retribution measured not in days, but in absolute destruction. "How unexpected." He looked up at Finch. "The Duke has made his position clear. You may go." Finch fled with as much dignity as a royal messenger could muster, leaving Blackwood alone with that terrible smile and the 3-sentence declaration of war sitting on his desk. At Ravenshollow, Clara stood by the window of what she'd begun to think of as her cage, watching snow clouds gather on the horizon. She heard the door open behind her, knew without turning who it was. The Duke moved with a particular kind of certainty that announced his presence before he spoke. "You're under my protection now, Lady Hargrove." His voice came from the doorway. "Blackwood won't touch you." She turned slowly, her hands gripping the windowsill behind her for support. He stood there in his riding clothes, snow still dusting his shoulders, and spoke of her safety as if it were already decided, already done, as if Percival were some minor inconvenience rather than the man who'd nearly killed her. "You don't know what you've done." The words came out hollow, exhausted. "Percival doesn't forgive defiance. He'll destroy you, your reputation, your standing, everything you've built. He has the connections to do it, and he will. He'll ruin you just to prove he can." Ravenscroft stepped fully into the room, and she saw something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder, more purposeful. "I sent Blackwood a letter this morning," he said. "I told him you were under my protection and that he should not ask for you again." Clara's breath caught. "You refused him? Outright?" The implications crashed over her like a wave. "He'll see that as a challenge, as an insult to his authority, his—" "I know what he'll see it as." "Then you know he'll come for both of us now. He won't just want me back. He'll want to make an example of you. To show every peer in England what happens when someone defies Percival Blackwood." Her voice cracked. "You've signed your own ruin for a woman you don't even know." Duke Sebastian Ravenscroft looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and for the first time since she'd woken in his house, Clara saw something that looked almost like anticipation. Let him try. The consequences arrived like dominoes falling, each one striking the next with inevitable force. Lady Margaret Thornwell descended on Ravenshollow 3 days after her brother's refusal, her carriage rattling up the drive with the fury of a woman whose careful social positioning was being threatened. She found Sebastian in his study, surrounded by legal documents and correspondence from his solicitor. "Have you lost your mind?" She didn't bother with pleasantries, stripping off her gloves with sharp, angry movements. "Sebastian, you're risking the family name, 300 years of reputation, for a girl you barely know." "I know enough." He didn't look up from the contract he was reviewing. "Do you?" Margaret's voice rose. "Do you know that Lord Blackwood is telling everyone you abducted his wife? That you're holding her against her will? The scandal is already spreading through London like wildfire." "Let it spread." "Damn you, Sebastian!" She slammed her hand on his desk. "I have children. Your nephews will have to live with whatever stain you leave on this family. Is she really worth that?" He finally looked up. and whatever Margaret saw in his eyes made her step back. Yes. In London, the whispers had already metastasized into outright condemnation. At Lady Ashworth's ball, the first major social event of the season, the Ravenscroft name was conspicuously absent from conversations. When the Duchess of Somerset mentioned Sebastian in passing, 3 women turned away as if she'd spoken something obscene. "I heard he stole her from her wedding bed," one matron whispered behind her fan. "Blackwood is beside himself. The poor man, legally married and his bride stolen by that rake. My husband says the Duke always thought himself above the law. Now we see his true character." The Ravenscroft allies who might have defended him stayed silent. Blackwood's influence ran too deep, his connections too valuable. One by one, Sebastian's political supporters found pressing reasons to distance themselves from a man who'd made an enemy of Percival Blackwood. The official investigation arrived on a gray morning, announced by the clatter of hooves and the gleam of a magistrate's seal. Sir Richard Pembroke was a thin, officious man who'd built his career on careful adherence to the letter of the law, and he stood in Ravenshallow's entrance hall with the self-righteousness of a man absolutely certain he was doing his duty. "Your Grace, I'm here regarding the alleged kidnapping of Lady Clara Blackwood." "Hargrove," Ravenscroft corrected coldly. "Her name is Hargrove." "Her married name," Pembroke countered, producing documents from his leather case, "is Blackwood. As certified by church registry and signed contract, I have questions about how she came to be at Ravenshallow." In the servants' corridor, Mrs. Ashford pressed close to Aldridge, her voice barely a whisper. "They're saying His Grace abducted her, that he broke into Blackwood's estate and stole her away. What if they arrest him? What if this goes to trial?" Aldridge's weathered face was grim. His Grace knew the risks. But did he know they'd twist it like this, make him the villain? The questioning went on for hours. Pembroke was thorough, methodical, his questions designed to trap rather than illuminate. When he finally left, it was with a promise to return, and with a parting observation that made even Ravenscroft's jaw tighten. "Lord Blackwood has been most patient, Your Grace. Most patient indeed." 2 days later, Pembroke returned with a warrant. Not for Ravenscroft's arrest, not yet, but something almost worse. He stood in the Great Hall with 2 constables flanking him and read from an official document bearing the Lord Chancellor's seal. "By order of His Majesty's Court, Lady Clara Blackwood is to be returned immediately to her lawful husband, Lord Percival Blackwood. Failure to comply constitutes contempt of court and obstruction of lawful matrimony." The law itself, written in formal script and pressed with official wax, demanded compliance. Clara heard every word from the hallway where she stood frozen, one hand pressed against the cold stone wall. She heard the magistrate's voice, heard the legal language that made her a piece of property to be returned, heard the trap closing around the man who'd risked everything to save her. She'd been a burden long enough. That night, after the house had gone quiet and the guards had settled into their watch, Clara made her decision. She would leave. Slip away before dawn, disappear into the countryside where neither Percival nor the Duke could find her. Better to die free on the moors than to destroy the one man who'd treated her like a person rather than a possession. She began to plan her escape. The stables were dark except for a single lantern Clara had managed to light with shaking hands. She'd made it past the house guards, down the servants' stairs, across the courtyard. Freedom was just a stolen horse away. Her fingers fumbled with a saddle when a voice cut through the darkness. "Going somewhere, Lady Hargrove?" Clara spun, her heart lurching. Duke Ravenscroft stood in the stable doorway, still fully dressed despite the late hour, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "I can't let you destroy yourself for me." The words tumbled out, desperate. "I'll disappear. Go north or to the continent, somewhere Percival can't. He'll find you." Ravenscroft stepped inside, and she noticed he carried a leather portfolio under one arm. "And when he does, you'll have no protection, no witnesses, no one to stop him from finishing what he started. Better me dead than you ruined." "Is it?" He set the portfolio on the stable's work table, dust motes swirling in the lantern, light. "Because I don't believe this was ever about keeping you alive or dead. Sit down, Lady Hargrove. There's something you need to see." Clara didn't move, poised between flight and curiosity. Ravenscroft opened the portfolio with deliberate calm, spreading documents across the rough wood, letters, contracts, property records, things she didn't immediately understand. "My solicitor, Mr. Jonathan Graves, has spent the last week investigating Lord Blackwood. His finances, his associations, his recent activities." Ravenscroft's finger traced a timeline someone had drawn in careful ink. "Do you know how close your family's estate is to Raven's Hollow?" 3 miles, perhaps 4. What did that matter? "And do you know that Blackwood specifically requested the church register your marriage at St. Mary's, the church that sits exactly halfway between his property and mine?" Clara stared at the map he'd laid out, seeing the locations marked in red ink. I don't understand." "This was never about you, Lady Hargrove. It was about me." He pulled out another document, a list of names, positions, appointments. "Blackwood and I are both being considered for the same Crown appointment, Royal Advisor to the Trade Commission. It's one of the most influential positions outside of Parliament. Control over colonial commerce, tariff negotiations, access to the King's private council." Her mind raced, trying to follow. "But what does that have to do with—" "Everything." Ravenscroft's voice was cold, clinical, as he laid out the trap she'd been caught in. "Blackwood deliberately brutalized you on your wedding night. He knew you'd run, any woman would, and he knew that running north from his estate, you'd end up on my land. The nearest powerful house, the obvious sanctuary." Horror dawned slowly, like frostbite spreading through her chest. "He wanted me to come to you. He needed a scandal. The accusation of stealing another man's bride, a legally married woman, would destroy my reputation completely, make me ineligible for any Crown appointment. Blackwood couldn't beat me on merit, so he manufactured a situation where I'd ruin myself trying to do the right thing." Clara's legs gave out. She sat heavily on a hay bale, the full weight of it crushing her. "I was bait. From the very beginning, I was just bait in a trap." "Yes." No comfort in his voice, just brutal honesty. "And you knew this? You knew and you still refused to give me back?" Her voice rose, edged with hysteria. "Knowing it would destroy everything you've worked for?" Ravenscroft gathered the documents with precise movements, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. When he finally looked at her, there was something dangerous in his eyes. Not anger, but the cold calculation of a man who'd just been handed a chess piece his opponent thought would checkmate him. Blackwood made one critical mistake. He closed the portfolio with a soft snap. "He assumed I'd surrender you to save myself." The words hung in the stable's darkness like a declaration of war. The Ashworth Ball was the pinnacle of London's social season. Crystal chandeliers dripping light onto marble floors, 500 of England's most powerful families gathered in silk and jewels and careful political alliances. It was the last place Clara expected Duke Ravenscroft to take her, and the last place she wanted to be. "Why are we here?" She stood rigid in the carriage as Ravenshollow's lights glittered through the window. She wore a gown his sister had left behind, deep emerald that made her look like someone worth fighting over, though she felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. "Because running accomplishes nothing." Ravenscroft adjusted his cuffs with infuriating calm. "And I'm tired of letting Blackwood control the narrative." Terror coiled in her stomach as they ascended the steps. Every eye turned toward them the moment they entered, conversations dying mid-sentence, fans snapping shut, the collective intake of breath that meant scandal had just walked through the door. Clara's fingers dug into Ravenscroft's arm as they were announced. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft, and Lady Clara Hargrove. Not Lady Blackwood. The omission was deliberate, inflammatory, and there, across the ballroom like a spider at the center of his web, stood Percival Blackwood. He wore evening black that made his pale face even more corpse-like, and when his eyes found Clara, he smiled. That predatory, possessive smile that promised she'd pay for every day of defiance. "He's here," Clara whispered, her blood turning to ice. "Sebastian, he's—" "I know." Ravenscroft's grip on her hand tightened. "Trust me." But as he led her deeper into the ballroom, directly toward the crowd rather than away from it, Clara's trust shattered into panic. He was going to give her back, right here, publicly, to save himself the humiliation of a trial. It was the smart choice, the political choice, the only choice that made sense. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. She'd been foolish to think, to hope. Ravenscroft stopped in the exact center of the ballroom, under the largest chandelier where every person in the room could see them clearly. Then he turned to face the orchestra and raised one hand. The music died. 500 people fell silent, the absence of sound so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Ravenscroft stood there, commanding attention with nothing but presence, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the gilded hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, I require a moment of your attention." Clara's hand trembled in his. This was it, the public surrender, the moment Blackwood won. "I am formally declaring my intention to marry Lady Clara Hargrove." The words dropped like stones into still water, each one creating ripples of shock that spread through the crowd. "Our engagement is effective immediately and will be published in tomorrow's Times." The world stopped. Gasps erupted from every direction. Someone dropped a champagne flute, the crystal shattering on marble. Lady Margaret Thornwell, standing near the refreshment table, went completely white and collapsed into her husband's arms in a dead faint. But Clara barely registered any of it because her mind had simply ceased to function. Engagement, marriage, intention. Across the ballroom, Percival Blackwood's face transformed from predatory satisfaction to something infinitely more dangerous, pure, incandescent rage. His pale skin flushed red, then white again, his hands clenching at his sides. Ravenscroft continued as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in London's social elite. "Lady Hargrove's previous arrangement was made under duress and will be challenged through proper legal channels. Until such time, she remains under my protection as my intended bride. Anyone who questions this may address their concerns to me directly." The last words carried an unmistakable edge, a challenge, a line drawn in marble and blood. The crowd erupted into chaos, voices rising, accusations flying, the scandal of the decade unfolding in real time. But through it all, Clara could only stare at the man beside her, the man who'd just made himself untouchable to Blackwood's accusations by claiming her publicly, legally, irreversibly. "Why?" she whispered, though the noise swallowed her voice. Ravenscroft looked down at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, something almost like warmth flickered in those dark eyes. "Because he assumed I'd choose myself over doing what's right. He was wrong." Across the ballroom, Blackwood shoved through the crowd toward the exit, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. As he passed close enough to be heard, he leaned toward Ravenscroft with venom dripping from every word. "This isn't over, Ravenscroft. Not even close." Then he was gone, leaving destruction and a declaration of war in his wake. Percival Blackwood's retaliation came like a plague, Systematic, suffocating, designed to destroy everything Sebastian Ravenscroft had built over a lifetime of careful political maneuvering. The first strike arrived with the Morning Post, 3 days after the Ashworth Ball. Anonymous pamphlets flooded London's coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs, printed on cheap paper but distributed with expensive precision. Clara found one that had somehow made its way to Ravenshollow, left on a table by a servant who didn't know better. "The Duke of Debauchery!" screamed the headline above a crude illustration of a man in nobleman's dress leading a woman in a wedding gown away from a church. The text beneath was worse. Accusations wrapped in moral outrage, designed to inflame rather than inform. Duke Ravenscroft, that supposed pillar of society, has revealed his true nature, a seducer of married women, a violator of sacred vows blessed by God and witnessed by the Church. He stole Lady Blackwood from her lawful husband's bed, corrupted her virtue, and now parades her publicly as his intended to legitimize his theft. There were dozens of them, each variation more vicious than the last. By week's end, Ravenscroft's name was synonymous with dishonor in every drawing room from Mayfair to Westminster. The business consequences followed swiftly. Lord Hampton withdrew his investment in Ravenscroft's shipping venture with a terse letter citing moral concerns. The Bellingham Consortium cancelled a lucrative contract for timber from the Ravenshollow forests. 3 other partnerships dissolved within days, each with carefully worded excuses that all meant the same thing. Association with Sebastian Ravenscroft was now poison. The social invitations stopped entirely. No more summons to court functions, no more dinner parties with influential families. Even the Royal Society, where Ravenscroft had been a member for a decade, sent a polite note suggesting he might wish to take a temporary leave from public engagements until this matter is resolved. Lady Margaret sent a letter instead of visiting, and its brevity cut deeper than any pamphlet. "Sebastian, I cannot support this. My husband forbids me from contact while this scandal continues. You've made your choice. Now we must live with the consequences. M." Clara watched it all unfold with growing horror, seeing the life Sebastian had built crumble piece by piece because he'd refused to surrender her. She tried to leave twice more. Both times, he stopped her. Blackwood's second strike came with the force of law behind it. The Lord Chancellor himself, Lord Victor Hastings, a man who owed Blackwood more favors than he could count, summoned a special ecclesiastical hearing. The evidence presented was damning. A church register from St. Mary's, signed and sealed, showing that the marriage between Percival Blackwood and Clara Hargrove had been fully consummated according to church law. Father Cornelius, a nervous priest with darting eyes and hands that shook when he held the Bible, testified under oath. "I witnessed the consummation blessing myself, my lords. The marriage was completed in all ways according to holy law." It was a lie. Clara knew it was a lie. She'd escaped before Percival could finish what he'd started. But the church register showed her signature beside Percival's, witnessed and dated, and the priest's testimony gave it legitimacy that her word alone could never overcome. The warrant arrived at Ravenshollow on a grey afternoon, delivered by Magistrate Pembroke with poorly concealed satisfaction. Behind him stood 6 armed constables and 2 Crown investigators, their presence making clear this wasn't a request. "Duke Sebastian Ravenscroft, you are hereby charged with adultery, theft of lawful property, and interference with holy matrimony. You will accompany us to London to answer these charges before the Lord Chancellor's court." Sebastian stood in his entrance hall, surrounded by men with weapons and warrants. The full weight of England's legal system turned against him. Clara watched from the stairs, her heart shattering as Captain James Lockhart, Ravenscroft's head of security, moved to his master's side, hand on his sword. "Your Grace," Lockhart said quietly, "say the word." For a terrible moment, Clara thought Sebastian might fight, might turn this into bloodshed and make everything infinitely worse. But he simply straightened his cuffs and nodded. "I'll come peacefully. There's no need for drama, Pembroke. You've made your point." They led him away in irons. Blackwood's third strike came for Clara herself. She'd been at Ravenshollow for 2 weeks, living in a house that felt increasingly like a tomb with its master imprisoned in London, awaiting trial. Captain Lockhart had doubled the guards, but even he couldn't watch every shadow, every corner of the estate's extensive grounds. Clara needed air, needed to think, needed anything other than the 4 walls of her room and the crushing guilt of what her presence had cost. She slipped out for an evening walk in the gardens, just to the rose arbor where she could see the moon rising over the moors. She never saw them coming. Hands grabbed her from behind, rough, practiced, covering her mouth before she could scream. 3 men, maybe 4, dressed in dark clothes without any identifying marks. She fought, drove her elbow into someone's ribs, heard a grunt of pain, but they were stronger, dragging her toward the garden's back gate where the walls were lowest. Then steel rang against steel. Captain Lockhart came out of the darkness like vengeance itself, his blade already drawn and moving. Behind him, 6 of Ravenscroft's household guards poured through the garden paths, cutting off escape routes. The fight was brief and brutal. These weren't trained soldiers, just hired thugs who broke and ran when faced with real opposition. All except one, Lockhart's blade found his shoulder, spinning him to the ground, and within seconds the man was pinned with a boot on his chest and a sword at his throat. "Who sent you?" Lockhart's voice was cold iron. The man spat blood, tried to laugh through his pain. "Go to hell." Lockhart pressed down harder. "I'll ask once more. Lord Blackwood sends his regards." The man gasped, his bravado cracking as the blade bit into skin. Says he'll have what's his. Says the Duke can't protect her from prison." But what Percival Blackwood didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that while he'd been executing his 3-strike attack, Jonathan Graves had been working in the shadows, gathering ammunition of his own. Physician records from Dr. Edmund Gray detailing Clara's injuries. Injuries consistent with violent assault, not consensual matrimony. Testimony from 3 of Blackwood's former household servants, all dismissed under suspicious circumstances, all with stories of his cruelty, financial records showing illegal dealings with French merchants during the trade embargo. And most damning of all, evidence that the church register had been altered after the fact, that Father Cornelius had been paid handsomely to commit perjury. There was more. Whispered testimony from 2 other women, one a baron's daughter, one a merchant's widow, both of whom had narrowly escaped becoming Lady Blackwood before Clara, both with scars that matched Clara's story. Sebastian Ravenscroft, sitting in a London cell awaiting trial, compiled it all into a dossier that would end political careers. Then he sent word to the one man in England whose authority superseded even the Lord Chancellor's. Mr. Graves delivered the evidence personally to the King's private secretary with a simple note attached. Truth before politics. Ravenscroft. 3 days passed in terrible silence. Then a royal messenger arrived at Ravenshollow, his horse lathered from hard riding, a sealed letter bearing the King's own crest. But he didn't ask for Clara, didn't ask for Lockhart or Aldridge or anyone at the estate. The messenger's next stop was London. The letter was addressed to Lord Percival Blackwood. 1 week later, the storm had passed, but the landscape it left behind was forever changed. The Crown's private inquiry into Lord Percival Blackwood's affairs was conducted behind closed doors with the kind of discretion that protected powerful families while still delivering consequences. The evidence Sebastian had compiled proved impossible to ignore. Physician testimony, financial records, witness accounts from women whose voices had been silenced by fear and social standing. Blackwood was stripped of his seat on the King's Council with immediate effect. The official statement cited conduct unbecoming of a royal advisor, which everyone understood meant far worse things that couldn't be spoken aloud in polite company. He was exiled to his country estate in Derbyshire, forbidden from entering London or attending court functions indefinitely. But there would be no criminal trial, no public prosecution. The Blackwood family had roots too deep, connections too valuable. His father was still the Earl of Pemberton, his uncle a bishop, his cousins scattered throughout the Houses of Parliament. They closed ranks, paid the right people, made the right promises. Percival would live out his exile in comfort and privilege, his crimes buried under the weight of aristocratic protection. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Clara's marriage was annulled by ecclesiastical court on grounds of coercion and falsified documentation. Father Cornelius confessed to perjury after his bank accounts revealed the substantial payment from Blackwood, and the church register was declared fraudulent. In the eyes of God and law, Lady Clara Hargrove had never been Lady Blackwood at all. She was free. Duke Sebastian Ravenscroft was released from custody with a formal apology from the Lord Chancellor, though the words tasted like ash, and everyone knew Hastings had only bent because the king himself had intervened. Sebastian's reputation began its slow recovery. Invitations, tentatively resumed. Business partners reached out with carefully worded letters, but the damage was done. He'd made enemies of everyone in Blackwood's circle, and they had long memories. Clara found him in Ravenshollow's library a week after his return, standing before the window that overlooked the snow-covered moors where he'd first found her. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, the weariness of a man who'd fought a war and won, but at a cost he was still calculating. "Sebastian." Her voice was quiet, tentative. They'd barely spoken since his release, both of them navigating the strange new reality of freedom and debt, and something unspoken between them. He turned, and for a moment she saw past the Duke's mask to the man beneath. Complicated, principled, far more human than his reputation suggested. "Why did you risk everything?" The question burst from her like a confession. "Your title, your position, your future in politics, all of it. For me. Why?" Sebastian was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her as if weighing how much truth she could handle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Because surrendering you would have meant surrendering to him. I don't lose to men like Percival Blackwood." It was an answer, but not the whole answer. Clara could see that in the way his jaw tightened, in the flicker of something deeper behind his carefully controlled expression. "And?" she pressed gently. He exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost vulnerable. "And because it was the right thing to do, whatever the cost. Not love, not political calculation, just principle, a bone-deep conviction that some things mattered more than self-preservation." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a realization blooming like warmth after frostbite. He'd saved her not because he wanted something from her, but because abandoning her would have meant abandoning himself. And somewhere in the chaos of scandal and violence and war, something deeper had grown between them. Something neither of them had names for yet. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "For making me untouchable." Sebastian's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "You were always worth protecting, Clara. It just took the rest of the world time to see it." Before either of them could say more, the library door opened. Mr. Henry Kavanagh, the butler, stood in the doorway with a sealed letter in his white-gloved hands, his weathered face carefully neutral in the way that meant trouble. Your Grace, this just arrived by royal courier. Sebastian took the letter, and Clara watched his expression shift as he saw the seal. Not Blackwood's crest, not Parliament's mark, but the unmistakable royal seal of the king himself. He broke the wax and read in silence. His expression hardened with each line, his shoulders tensing. "What is it?" Clara asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Sebastian looked up, and in his eyes she saw something that looked almost like grim anticipation. "A summons. From the king himself. I'm to appear before his majesty in 3 days' time." The words hung in the air like an unspoken threat. The Duke had made her untouchable, had defeated Percival Blackwood, had survived scandal and arrest and war. But in doing so, he'd caught the attention of someone far more dangerous than any lord or magistrate. The crown itself. Far away in Derbyshire, in a country estate that felt more like a gilded cage with each passing day, Percival Blackwood sat in his study reading a letter that had arrived that morning. No royal seal this time, just a plain envelope with familiar handwriting. As he read, a smile spread across his pale face. Cold and patient and infinitely dangerous. The war wasn't over. It was simply entering a new phase. And this time, Ravenscroft would have no one to protect him.